So I'm going to be talking about CSS today, and we're going to be playing with CSS all semester. In fact, the final exam will be applied CSS. I will give you an HTML file that has everything you need, and I will give you a CSS file with a little bit of information in it, and then I'll give you a picture, and you will apply the styles to the HTML. You won't change the HTML document. You'll apply the styles so that your website matches the picture that I give you. So it's a core part of this class. So what we're going to be looking at today, first we're going to be talking about understanding the advantages of using cascading style sheets. Then we're going to go over an introduction to the Cascade. The Cascade is the way that the rules are applied, because you can set presentation content in different locations, or presentation rules in different locations. We're going to be showing you a little bit about using color on web pages, creating style sheets that configure color and text properties, inline styles, embedded styles, external styles, class and ID selectors. So the advantages of CSS, you'll start seeing a little bit more as we walk into the examples today. But the main advantage is that it allows us to have a great deal of control over the way that we present the information on our pages. And the way that I mean that is that we can set up a set of rules that will apply to an entire website. We can set up rules that will apply to an individual page, or we can set up rules that apply to an individual element or a group of elements in a single page. What it allows us to do is, once we understand the Cascade and how you use the different types of style sheets, it allows you a lot more control with a lot less coding. So it's real time saver in the way that we approach the way that we present the information in our pages. Now, we're going to be doing Lab 3. It's CSS and Zen Garden. That's the Wednesday lab. And that's actually a pretty significant lab that we're going to be doing on Wednesday. So I'm not going to go over in detail some of the rules of the Cascade. Rather, today we're going to try and understand sort of the big picture. And then on Wednesday, when you're doing the lab, you'll get more into details about how the things apply within it. So we're not going to go into a lot of the detail until we get to the lab. But the main thing to understand is that the closer the presentation rule is to the individual item or group of items that it's changing, the more powerful that rule is, or the more influence it has. So that by nature, your browser has a set of default style rules. Like if you go to a page and they haven't said what color they want a hyperlink to be, it's going to be blue and it's going to be underlined. That's the default of the browser. The closer you can get down to where you apply rules to an individual letter, or an individual word, or an individual object. So the closer that rule is to the object that it's influencing, the more powerful it has. So that if I have a rule that is at the browser level or an external style sheet, when it gets down to the closer element, the rule closer is going to overrule it. So when we talk about the Cascade, what we're talking about is there is... Fix my microphone here. If you see that tilt again, let me know, because that's for the people that aren't in here. And they can't hear when it tilts down. Hopefully this will work. Anyway, I digress. What was I talking about? The more influence it has. Oh, the Cascade. The thing to understand about the Cascade is there's 4 different levels of rules that can be used in the presentation. There's the browser, the default of the browser. There's external style sheets. There's embedded style sheets, which are within an individual document. And then there are inline styles. And the rules flow down from one to the next until they're overruled by something at a closer level. So if you think of it like a waterfall, you can imagine it that the rules are sort of like water that sort of makes its way down. A rule applied at the furthest level is going to apply until something else overrides it. Okay, so that's sort of the really generic version. And inline is more specific than embedded, which is more specific than external, which is more specific than the browser default. And in order to set up these rules, we've got a syntax. Just like we were talking about the rules when we were talking in XML, you have to have a certain syntax in order for it to work. The same thing applies with CSS in that what you've got is different components that make up a rule. You've got the selector and the declaration. The declaration has the property and the value. So I'm saying in the example that's on the screen here, we've got the body, and to the body I want to declare the property of color, and the value of that color in this case is blue. So those are the parts, and they get sort of more and more complicated as we go into the semester, but that is always going to be the basis, is that you've got a selector, a property or a group of properties, and a value or a group of values. And you can apply more than one value in some properties, and you can have multiple properties on any given selector. Now we're going to start looking at the use of color. That's an attribute that can be applied to many different kinds of objects. You can apply it to text. You can apply it to backgrounds. You can apply it to lines. You can apply it to borders. Any number of different objects that you're manipulating. Color is one of the ways that we're going to do it. And it's the most visible way of looking at the Cascade. So that's the thing that we're going to take a look at. And I'm going to escape from this presentation. And I want to pull up a website, and I'm actually pulling up my website. So I went to Introduction to CSS, and what I have here is a index.html file. I'm going to change the size with my browser of the font just to make it a little easier to see. And that's another thing to understand, is that even though you're designing these pages, the end user has a lot of control with their browser. In fact, I have the ability to completely turn off all your presentation rules. And so you have to keep that in mind when you're designing, is that you're never going to have it so that a web page looks exactly the way you want it to see on everybody's screen, because the nature of the web gives some of that control to the end users. So what we've got here is different types of styles. Introduction to CSS. It's the way we manipulate the presentation of the information that is on the page, and that is a core fundamental principle of this class and of web design. So let's look at some of them. The first thing I want to show you is inline styles. Now, I'm going to have to go back to my smaller font to demonstrate this. So an inline style, if you recollect, is the closest thing to the element that it's changing. So that has the most power and influence over the other. In this case, what I have done is I have given the rules of, this is an H1, a heading level 1, and I've told it to be red with a gray background. Now, the way that I've done this, and I'm going to bring up Dreamweaver here so that you can see how I've done this. And that's the inline styles page. So what I've done is I've taken, and this is an H1, and we come over here and we look in the code, and you'll see that this is an H1. There's the selector there, and here's the attributes. I've told it a style equals a color of FF000, that's a hexadecimal color, and the background color of CCCC. So the FF000, is that 4 O's? 4 O's, or zeros, that's red. 6 C's of the hexadecimal is gray. So there's a lot of information about the hexadecimal colors in the textbook. In the color section at the back of the textbook, there's actually a diagram that shows you the hexadecimal colors. I could have also come in here and done red and gray, and I could have done it that way as well. So there's different ways to do this, but what I've done is I've given it a color and a background color. But you'll notice that I applied that within this H1. So here's my H1 element, and that style element is actually applied within the tag for that element. That's what makes it an inline style. You'll notice that when I come down to this H1, those rules don't apply. Because they are inline, they apply only to the styles that are within the tags that you have chosen to do. Now, that said, I can apply some things like a span or an ID or a class that will allow it to create, for instance, if I wanted 3 or 4 different paragraphs, I could put them in a span, and then I could apply that rule, and it would apply to all those paragraphs. So there's flexibilities in there that are built into this, but those styles only apply within the object that you have specified for them. Now let's go back to the browser, and again, gray, red. Now let's go and look at an embedded style sheet. Embedded styles are one level up on the Cascade from the inline styles. So inline styles would override the embedded styles. So let's go look at the embedded styles. And here we have another page, basically the same, but with different styles applied. And so if you look at this example, we've got an H1 here, then we've got an H2 there, but then I come down here to an H1, and that looks a little bit different, but that H1 looks the same as this H1. So we've got multiple things happening in here, especially with our H1s. H1, again, is a header level 1, which is a structural element that says this is a top level of importance in this page. So I've built structure into this page with H1s, but I've somehow segregated them or changed them by applying styles that allow it to look differently depending upon the context. And let's take a look at how I did that. So what we're looking at here is the embedded style sheet. This is the same document we were just looking at. And we've got a lot of different things going on in there. So let's take a look at what we've done here. First off, when we do embedded styles, they sit within the head tag. The head tag, as you recall, is at the top of the document. It's immediately after the HTML document. And that is the information that is there for the browser to read, but isn't displayed to the human. So we put our style rules that are in an embedded in the head because it applies to the entire body. And my head tag goes from there to there. And you may have just noticed, and this is a good tool to learn to use, that I came down here and I just clicked the head tag in order to do that. This is a context-specific selector, part of Dreamweaver, that makes it really easy to grab exactly what you want to work on. While I'm in here, for instance, here's the style. If I choose the style, it's just going to select that style element. It's within the head still, but I only selected the style. So this little section down here is a good thing to get in the habit of learning how to use because it will save you grief. Because one of the rules is that you can't have a selector open inside of a box and close outside of that same box. And you can get into some trouble when you're coding if you're not completely familiar, and that helps you to do that. You'll understand more about that later. So I've put these styles inside of my header on this page. They're only going to apply to this page. And let's look at what we've done. We've given it a background color, and then we've given it a color, which is a font color, and we've given it a font family for the body. So we've said everything, unless we give it another rule, is going to use this font family, this color, and this background color. Going back to the page, that's what it looks like. And the background color that we have here isn't showing up real well because of the projector laptop interference. If you're looking at it on your page, I think it's more of a purplish color on your screen. But so we've got this set of rules here. We've applied a text color and we've applied a background color. Now, we've also, with H1, we have applied a background color of, and I'm going to bring your eyes over to this properties window here. This is another place where you can interact with your with your presentation information, your CSS. So you can interact with it here, or you can interact with it here, or you can open up this other. Oh, I chose new. I can open up this other window, and that's 3 different places where you can manipulate the same information. So it really comes down to what are you comfortable with. I personally like to use this window that is accessible through the pencil tool. But I can see that my color is blue, my hexadecimal is 1970. I could apply my font. Here you can see where it's just applied to font family and a line height. All of this is in there. And that information is also visible here. So we've got a background color of 1970. We've got a color, we've got a line height, and we've got a font family. Okay, so that's the H1s. So anything that shows up on the H1s, if it's just an H1, is going to have that. We've done the similar kind of thing with the H2s. Here's an H2 down here. We've given it a bit different background color, different font color, etc. But you'll see once again that down here I've got an H1 and that doesn't match. So how did I make that happen? Let's take a look at that. So with our H1s, we're there, but then I get down to this where we've got a dot different. Okay, so I've set up a different rule there called dot different. Now, dot means it's a class. A class is a way of designating a group of items as being a group. So whatever rules you apply to a class, it's going to happen to everything with that same class. So let's go to our code here. And so we've got 2 sections here that are blue with white font. And when we come down here and look in the code, what I've done is I've applied a class of different. So what that does, when the browser comes and looks at this, it sees that, hey, that header level 1 has been given a class of different, so I have got to apply whatever rules apply not to the H1, but to the class of different. And that follows that rule of the more specific you get, the more influence the rule has. So H1 is the rule that's going to apply that makes it blue with a white background. But because I have a more specific, I've got an H1, but it's an H1 with the class of different, then it goes to that other set of rules. Okay, so the closer and more specific you get to whatever you're affecting, that rule is going to overcome the ones that have come before it. So if that wasn't the case, I would have H1 and this would be showing up the same color as this. But because we specified the class of different, then I applied the rules up here that go with the dot different. So anytime you see dot in front of a style, that means that it's applying to a class. So I've got class here, and then I've got this other thing sitting down here, and there's only one of them. In this case, what I did is I used an ID. Okay? IDs function the same way that classes do, in that they become more specific, and so the rules applied to them overrules other things in the Cascade. But the difference between a class and an ID is with classes, you're dealing with a group. So you can have 2 paragraphs that have the class of different, but an ID has to be unique in the page. There can only be one of them. So if I had coded this and had 2 IDs of unique, my page would break. The browser would vomit and say, I cannot do this, you've broken the rules. Okay, so class you can have is for groups. IDs have to be unique in the page. Absolutely have. Yeah, Hannah? Yeah, just give it a different ID. So, it shouldn't be random. It should be something that makes sense to you, like blue background, white background, gray background. And it shouldn't begin with a number. It cannot begin with a number. ID equals, and then something that's alphanumeric. And normally you're going to want to use something that makes sense. Like the words that I used here, and I hate that little... Here I use the ID of unique because I'm trying to get across the idea that it has to be unique in the page. And whereas in the class I use different because those are different than the H1 tag for the page. So it's good to get in the idea, in the practice of using stuff when you're coding that makes sense to you so that you can understand why you did that. So if I was going to do a baseball roster, I might have, say I want to have pitchers' names in one color and catchers in another and fielders in another. I can give them each a class, pitchers, so that the pitchers' names show up in blue, and I would give it a rule of dot pitchers because it's a class. And then if I wanted to have the coach, I would then use pound coach because there's only one coach. It's unique. I would use an ID instead of a class. So that's the way that this all plays out. So those are embedded styles. This style sheet applies to this page and this page only. I have flexibility within this page by adding things such as the ID and class that get more specific than the general rules that are put in. As long as I put a rule in the styles and give it a related identifier, then I can get more specific. That gives you a lot of flexibility within that page of how you want to manipulate your presentation. So now let's go to further up, a step further up on the Cascade is an external style sheet. I have a quick answer. Right. The dot, the question is, I've got let me get up here. I don't know what I just did, but I'm going to undo it. I've got, at the top here, I've got dot different. That means, the dot means I'm doing a class. So when I'm styling, the dot means class, and the pound means ID. So if I put a class in there, and I try to apply a rule of pound, whatever it is, it's not going to find it. So that's the way that, and you'll get more familiar with that as you go. And Dreamweaver takes care of a lot of that for you. But that's a good pickup because that does specify different things. So we're moving on to external style sheets. You would use it, you would have to put it in each page you're going to use it. Now, what you're getting to is the Cascade. If you used that, let's say the class and ID of different and unique, if I use them in an embedded style sheet, that's only going to work on that page. Okay, because when I pull up, for instance, this page, it's not going to go look at the styles that are in another page. But now we're getting to an external style sheet. And this is where you have the ability to style a whole bunch of pages to have the same rules. And the way that we do that, and the key is in the word external, we make a link to an external style sheet. That's a .css file, cascading style sheet file. And in that cascading style sheet file are the rules. Now, you'll notice when I go to the embedded styles, the rules were in the head section of my document. When I go to an external style sheet and I look in the head, I don't have that. What I do have is a link. And what that link is it's telling me, it's telling me that I am going to draw information from an external document. So I'm linking to an external document that contains my style and presentation rules. So in this case, it's called intro CSS stylesheet.css. You can link to any style sheet. You're going to want it to be in your website, but you can link to any style sheet that you want. You can actually link to multiple style sheets within the same document, but we won't go into that today because that gets confusing. But we're linking to an external style sheet. Now you'll notice when I come into the embedded styles and I'm looking at the top of the document here, there's sort of the address of this, but nothing else. When I come over to the external styles, you'll see that there's a source code tab here, and there is this other tab that is the style sheet. So while I'm working here, both of those files are actually accessible to me at the same time. And while I may be looking at my source code when I'm creating styles, it's actually applying them in this style sheet window. So let's go to what I've done here. And I've got a intro CSS style sheet. That's what I'm looking at here. This window over here is the HTML document that I was working on. On this side, I can switch between looking at the code for the two. So when you make that link, they are literally linked. It's not just saying there's a style sheet over there, but when you change the content in the style sheet, it affects what's happening in the HTML. So let's look at what's going on in this document. And this is a fairly simple style sheet. I've got a background color of gray, and you'll see over here a background color of gray. With my H1, I've got a background color of FFF, which is white. And when you have a hexadecimal code that's all the same letter or the same number, you can just put the first three, and Dreamweaver will abbreviate that for you. It's not something you have to memorize. It's going to happen, and then as long as you understand that's why it happened. So I've set a background color for the H1, which is why this background color is here. It's applying only to the H1. And then there's this container tab, which doesn't really make a lot of sense on this page. Let's go to the web browser and look at this page. Oops, wrong web browser, wrong page. Okay, so what we're looking at is the external style sheets page. So I click on that, and here we have that document. I've got my H1 is black text with white background, gray background on the page, and it just sort of sits here. When I link to this other page, and I've got another page linked that happens to be using the same style sheet, notice what happened there. I went from a page that's taking up my entire browser window to one that is centered and only using 80% of the browser window. How did that happen? I'm using the same style sheet for both of those. Let's go back to Dreamweaver. So here's the style sheet, and it's a very simple style sheet. And what I've done is I've applied it to this document, but I've also applied it to external styles 2.html. And yet those two pages display differently. So what I was able to do in this external styles 2 page is I somehow put code in there that takes advantage of the rules but displays differently. So what I did is I created a div. And if you recall from when we first started talking, div means division, and essentially that means box. So we've created a box, and if I come down here and click on it, so I've got a div here, which is a box, and this content is inside the box. And you'll notice that I created this so that everything inside the body tag is within this div. So I've put a box inside the body tag that contains everything else, and I've given that an ID of container. So why does that make it behave differently? So I go back to my style sheet, and you'll see that I've got a style in here that says, when I've got an ID of container, set the margin left to auto, set the margin right to auto, and set the width to 80%. So what that piece of code does, and you're going to want to remember that piece of code if you're ever going to try and center a page, the content of a page within the page, that's how you do it. That is your solution right there. And what that does is it takes and it looks at the margins, sets them the same on the left and the right, and then in this case it was told to make it at 80%, so it's displaying on 80% of my browser. So that is the way that you can center your entire page. You have to put it into a container, a div, and then you apply those rules of auto margin left, auto margin right, and whatever percent you want to do it. And so using this external style sheet, we created different styles, and you can actually make them significantly different appearances by using different classes, IDs, and elements within the page. So that is sort of, in a nutshell, how style sheets work. Everything with presentation fits within that framework of it's either inline, embedded, external, or if you don't have any rules with any of those, then it uses the browser's default. Yep, the closer you get to whatever you're identifying, that it takes out everything else that's above it in the cascade. Yeah, the more specific it is, the more influence it has in that it'll just make it forget all the other ones. Now, that said, if you make the mistake of putting two different sets of rules for the same ID, so if you had pound different at the top of your cascading style sheet and said you wanted the text blue, and then at the bottom of the same style sheet you put pound different and you said you wanted the text purple, the text is going to be purple because it read that rule after the first one. So sometimes you'll be changing things and nothing's happening, and it's because you've got duplicates of the same selector in there. And let me just real quick look at my notes. I think that pretty much is going to wrap up the presentation, and then I'll go to questions about this. So we talked about color and we applied it. The style sheets, inline, embedded, external. And then we used the classes and the IDs to distinguish different sections of the same documents. And that is the end of my notes. So that is the Cascade in a nutshell.
So when you went and did that separate sheet,
The external style sheet?
do you have to write that whole link thing, or did you just write like the external one and then you linked it, like drag it?
Yeah. We'll learn more about this as we go on, but you can either create a blank style sheet first and then link to it, or when you're working within an HTML document, what you'll find is that, let me just grab something here. I'm not going to save what I'm doing, but when you come in, you'll see there's this HTML tab, which is when you're dealing with the content, and then there's the CSS tab down here when you're dealing with the presentation. You'll get familiar with this because you're going to use it a lot. You can do a new CSS rule there, or you can create a new CSS rule here, and this is the one that I found the easiest. But I choose that, and when you create a new rule, you've got the option in here to choose whether the rule will be in this document only, which would make it an embedded style, or you can link to an existing style sheet, or you can create a new style sheet. Okay, so it gives you multiple ways to get at creating a linked to style sheet. If you already have a style sheet created, you can choose this little link button, and that you essentially will navigate to it, point to the file, and that makes that link. Yep. No, the lab is the Zen Garden, and then there will be case study part 2. So in D2L, the question is lab 2 the case study? Lab 3 is the CSS and Zen Garden, and I link to that within the content now. The case study right now doesn't have a link because I haven't put that file in place yet. The way that the case studies are going to work is that I will try to have those available to you on Wednesdays, and I will grade them not the next day, but the following Thursday. So you'll have a full week to work on the case studies. And every Thursday morning, at least this semester, is when I will grade the case studies. If you're listening to this after the spring of 2012 and I'm still using this lecture, then it probably won't apply. I'll give you the rules then. See, now that's thinking ahead. No, the case study will be, you'll upload it to your website, and I will just go to the website. And I'll give you directions. You actually need to, within the case study documentation, you need to create a link to your case study from the exercises page. And I'll give those directions week by week. Because sometimes you're going to work in more than one folder for these case studies. So sometimes you'll create a new folder, and you'll just create a new link from the exercises page. And that's how I'll get to it, from your exercises page. The first part 1, I will grade Thursday morning. Part 2, I will grade the following week. Yeah, hold on. I'm going to go ahead and stop this recording because we're dealing with specifics of this semester. I'll talk to you guys.